Hello and welcome to Gear Chronicles. I'm Jake, and this is going to be the place where I can talk a little bit about everything from the history and use of gear to the gear itself. Today I want to do a sort of guide on dating U.S. military surplus, specifically in the time period from around World War I to the modern era. I really want this first episode to be something that people can look back to and reference. So let's just get right into it by starting off with the most common way used for the first half of the 20th century, which doesn't seem to follow any specific government guidelines for how equipment was stamped. It was just left up to the manufacturer's discretion.
It's an extremely simple system with just the year and the manufacturer's name stamped onto the piece of equipment. Here I have a World War I era grenade carrier vest. The stamp on this is quite faded, but I can still make out the date, which is May 1918. The manufacturer's name is very hard to read, but it seems to say CP & Co. Inc. It is also marked under the date with an inspected John E. Wright. This basic system would be used right up through World War II and into the Korean War. To show you a later example, here's an M1910 Canteen cover where the stamp is still clear. The year of manufacture is 1951, and it is made by Colette Manufacturing Company.
Something that has more information on it is this individual protective cover, which has both the stock number and a contract number, along with a complete date of the 9th of December 1944. And the main detail I wanted to focus on this was the stock number.
This predates the federal stock number system, and although I'd love to deep dive into the history of the U.S. military stock numbering systems, I will refrain as it gets a bit complicated. To keep it simple, the first use of the federal stock number, or FSN, was in 1949, though it would not be named that until about 1955. At the same time, the other systems being used by the Army and Navy were still in use until the federal catalog could be created and fully implemented. The FSN would remain in use until 1974, when it would be replaced by the National Stock Number, or NSN, but we'll talk more on that later.
Alright, now moving on to the Defense Agency. A rather generic name, but an important step in establishing a single agency to manage all of the military's needs. Established in 1953 and lasting until 1961, they would start to issue out new contract codes, which featured a 2-digit year suffix at the end of the contract. Even still, some clothing and gear will have multiple dates on their tags.
Using this M1951 field jacket as an example, we can see that it also has something that is just labeled date. This is more than likely the date of manufacture, and this could be confusing since it says 1958 and the code says 1959.
Now in this case, the best guess I have is that the contract year suffix is referring to the fiscal year, not calendar year. I'm not entirely sure if these early contracts were using fiscal year, but I feel like it's safe to assume so. If anyone knows for sure, drop a comment down below.
The federal fiscal year at the time started on July 1st, so the date listed on the jacket is 18th of September 1958, which falls into the fiscal year of 1959. This lines up with the contract code having the year code of 59 at the end of it. The fiscal year, however, would change in 1976, where the beginning of the fiscal year was moved from July 1st to October 1st, where it remains unchanged to this day.
This is important to remember for when we get into later contracts. It's also important to note that this is just the year the contract was issued, not necessarily the year it was produced. All contracts are different with different stipulations for completion, like the time in which the contract is expected to be completed.
By 1961, it became apparent that the system in place was too hard to manage and was in need of reorganization. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara would create a new, separate supply and service agency which would be named the Defense Supply Agency, or DSA. They would begin formal operations in January of 1962, and in the same year, the code would change again to reflect this change in agency. From 1962 to 1964, the code would usually end with a 2-digit year suffix, though this can sometimes be flipped with the letter at the end of the contract code. Using this M1956 entrenching tool cover, we can see a DSA-1-143-E-62. The 1 indicates the class, which in this case is clothing and individual equipment. The next 3 or 4 numbers are the unique contract code. These numbers are specific to that contract in order to avoid confusion with other contracts of the same type issued to different contractors in the same year. This is followed by E for the type of contract. I was not able to figure out what type E is though. This is followed by 62, which is the 2-digit year suffix. In 1965, the contract code was simplified to DSA-1, deleting the year suffix. The end of the code usually has the 3 or 4 numbers. Like before, these are unique to this contract. The following year, the 1-digit class number is replaced with a 3-digit number. In this case, the 1 is replaced by 100, and this would remain the code for clothing and individual equipment. There are other class codes, but we won't get into them for the scope of this video. This code still lacks a 2-digit year suffix or any specific dating code. As you can see here on this lightweight rucksack, it has a DSA-100-712. This is the only year that code looks this way, so it's an automatic indicator that this fiscal year is 1966.
The Defense Supply Agency would change the code once more in 1967, and this would stick around for a little while. This system is called officially the PII, or Procurement Instrument Identification Number.
Using the stamping on the back of this M1967 Canteen cover, the code reads as DSA-100-72-C-1281. Breaking this down, we can see DSAs before. Right after, we see 100, which, as stated before, stands for the class the contract falls under. Moving on to the 72, which is, of course, the 2-digit year suffix and is short for 1972. This is then followed by the letter C, which still stands for the type of contract. In this case, C is for the contract purchase, but like the class code, I haven't been able to solidify what the other letters stand for, so I apologize for that. The last 4 digits, like I stated earlier, are just the unique contract identification code.
Remember earlier when I mentioned the FSN getting replaced by the National Stock Number, or NSN? Here's when that happens.
Introduced in 1974, the NSN is also known as the NATO stock number. It expanded from the federal stock number's 11 digits to 13 digits. For simplicity, we'll focus on the National Codification Bureau, or NCB, sometimes called the Country or Nation Code. This 2-digit code is assigned to each country. The US uses codes 00 and 01, while NATO standard items are coded as 11. Similar codes are assigned to all NATO and NATO-sponsored countries. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get back to contract codes.
In 1977, the DSA was renamed to the Defense Logistics Agency, which it's still called today. The main change in contracts from 1978 onward is that DLA replaces DSA in the codes. For instance, here's an Alice LC2 belt with a contract issued in 1978 by the Defense Logistics Agency. DLA remained the issuing agency until 1994, when the System Program Offices took over. The SPO was established to create a single point of contact for contractors and government agencies. As before, the only difference in the contracts is that SPO replaced DLA in the codes. This is where things get a little bit more confusing. In the mid-2000s, the codes changed again.
You start to see SPM1C1 instead of the usual SPO100 at the beginning of the code. I've read that this stands for Special Procurement One-Time Contract for 1 calendar year, but if someone knows more for sure, please leave a comment below. This isn't the only unusual contract you'll see on more modern equipment. The ACH I have here has a W911QY code, which remains a mystery to me. Perhaps in the future I'll do an update on these more modern codes.
One thing that I must mention is that from about the late 1960s to the present day, agencies other than the DSA, DLA, or SPO may issue contracts. Now, fortunately, there is a list, though last updated in 2000. It gives us a kind of an idea of what each code means and where it comes from. I'll link to the database below, but let's quickly go over a couple of examples.
The first example is the PASGIT with detachable liner that I featured in a recent video. As I mentioned then, you can see the code is M00264, which refers to the Marine Corps Regional Contracting Office based in Quantico, Virginia. A more common example you'll encounter is DAAK60, which was used by the U.S. Army Natick Research and Development Center, more commonly known as Natick Labs. A quick example is this Gore-Tex cold weather jacket with the contract issued in 1985. While this code is common for experimental or prototype contracts, it's not strictly limited to those.
We're nearly finished, but there's one final agency that often confuses people. In 1965, the Philadelphia Quartermaster Depot was renamed as the Defense Personnel Support Center, or DPSC. The DPSC continued the depot's legacy as an essential clothing and textile supply center. In 1998, it was renamed the Defense Supply Center Philadelphia, and in 2010, it became the DLA Troop Support, a name it retains to this day. The reason this is important is the contract codes that you will find issued by the DPSC are vastly different from the normal contract codes that you will be used to seeing.
For example, on this early ERDL Jungle Top, you can see that there is only a contract number of 7384. This does not refer to a date. Dating DPSC items is quite challenging and is not an area where I have particular expertise. Unless you know the specific year a contract was issued, the best way to estimate the year is by examining the features of the item in question. Later on, some contracts included a 2-digit year suffix. For example, I have a combat aircrew coat, which has a contract date of 1993.
Alright, I wanted to include more information, but I felt like it was just going to be too much for one video, and I'll just save it for future videos. To make it easier for you to reference later, I'll try to divide this into chapters. It's also important to note that not all of these are hard and fast rules. There's always exceptions and items that don't follow the norm, so keep that in mind. You also should try to keep in mind that there is commercial codes that kind of mimic real codes. You'll find them, a common one I can think of is DLA becomes DAL, and I do want to do a video on that, so, to differentiate them. There's some things there that can get complicated, but it was too much for this video, so I'll try to do that soon, so look out for that. Okay, so that was the first episode of Gear Chronicles. Now, it's going to be my main show, but the whole idea of it was just so that I could have something that was an umbrella that can cover anything. So that way I can kind of jump from topic to topic and not have it be in any like chronological order or something along those lines. So there's no really going to be a rhyme or reason to how I do things. It's really just going to be what I have access to and what I have research materials and the ability to do an episode on. So that way I can just not be bogged down by trying to find every piece or looking for all the information on the internet that I can find on something. I can kind of jump to the next project and bring that in and then go back to something else later. And I know from like the viewer perspective, from you guys' perspective, that it probably doesn't really matter. But to me, it's just easier for me to like kind of organize and categorize things. So that's just a me thing. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this format. And as always, thanks for watching.